I'm Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 141. And this week, it's Terri's turn to share something. But also this week, we're breaking a little bit from our usual tradition in that I put in a request. I was editing the Fasting Method podcast, and it was the Valentine's Day episode, which when this episode comes out, will have been out last week. So I thoroughly recommend you go and listen to that too, because it was most enjoyable. I'll put a link in the notes. But Terri, you mentioned a book called, I think, The 5 Love Languages, and you touched on it a bit in the episode relevant to what you were talking about in that episode to do with fasting and communicating with people and whatnot. But I thought it sounded really, really interesting and I wanted to hear more. So I asked if you could possibly share some more information from that with us today, especially as I believe this episode is coming out the day before, I think, Valentine's Day. So perfect timing as well. All the stars aligned, and it fits in nicely with our unintended series on relationships and the importance of connection. So very long-winded intro there, but Terri, what have you got for us today?
Well, Daisy, I have the answer to your request. So it was kind of interesting when you asked me about this, and I had kind of forgotten that I had brought it up in that previous recording. So this is actually a book that I read many years ago when I was a therapist. And it's one of those concepts that I think many of us benefit if we have at least some grasp of it. You don't have to become experts on it. It's not that complicated of a theory, but, it reminds me a little bit of Gretchen Rubin's The 4 Tendencies or Personalities, whatever she refers to those as. Like, it's helpful to have that as a frame of reference. So I think this is a good reference for people in their relationships, and I would say more intimate relationships. So friendships, definitely romantic relationships, marriages, partnerships, and even relationships with kids. This concept can be really useful. It comes from a book called The 5 Love Languages, The Secret to Love That Lasts, and the author's name is Gary Chapman. Many people listening to this today have probably seen reference to it before, heard about it, maybe even took the online quiz to find out what their love language is.
Oh, there's a quiz. I'm definitely doing the quiz. I love a quiz.
Definitely a quiz. But before we get into the different languages, I wanted to talk just a little bit kind of about his intro into the book, because it's been so long since I read this book and you had asked, I'm like, okay, well, I went back and listened to the book again. So he spends the first few chapters really talking about people struggling in their primary relationships. His focus is a lot on marriage, but, people focusing on their primary romantic relationship. And one of the primary struggles being, this person is not who I dated. What happened? When we were dating, we were just so in sync and everything was perfect. And what he talks about is that early in a relationship, naturally, we are under the influence or the force of the love obsession.
Lust goggles.
Yeah, really. Everything that person does is great. We're doing things for that person that are uncharacteristic of us because we're in this weird in-love state. And then, again, in his book, he focuses a lot on marriage. But then after the marriage, why doesn't that last? Why isn't that what's going on now? And so in looking at couples and studying it, he came up with this concept of that there are different love languages. And the important thing is to learn what your partner's love language is and also what yours is, because this is most often the complexity of why people aren't feeling loved in their relationship.
Yeah, mismatch.
He gave examples of couples that he talked to and one man that he talked to who was on his 3rd marriage and everything seems great. And then boom, this happens. So started to explain to people and help people identify their love language. So the important thing that I think as I talk about this is to remember there are 5 of these love languages. Generally, we have one that is preferred. It is our primary love language, but we may also benefit and like the other ones as well. Mm-hmm. But we tend to have one that is our most prominent one. It is the way we most know that we are loved. It is what someone else can do that for us makes us know they love us. And vice versa. If we know what our partner's love language is, we can communicate that. We can do things in that language. And the way I've always thought about this concept is it's like you take a couple and one speaks Spanish and one speaks French. And the one speaking Spanish is letting the one, now, I don't speak those languages, but I know there's enough overlap. You probably could guess what the person is saying. But the idea that if I'm speaking to you in Spanish, but you only speak French, you're not going to hear my message.
No.
And I'm going to be pounding my head against the wall, like, why doesn't she know this? I've said it every way possible. But again, the point is, I'm saying it in Spanish, but you're only able to interpret French.
And presumably that's part of the issue, is that your personal bias, your way of thinking is along the lines of your love language. So you kind of assume that the other person speaks the same language, even if you know it's not theirs. But surely you understand my language. But even if you can go that far, you just this is my love language, so it's everybody's love language.
That's right. So logically, everyone should be communicating love in this way. Now, interestingly, it's not true for everyone that your primary way that you receive love is also the primary way you communicate love. Because remember, we learn a lot watching other people. So if I watched my primary caretakers and how they express love, I may have learned a way to do it that actually isn't the way that I feel loved.
Oh gosh, interesting. So it gets even more confusing. So somebody could be trying to guess what your love language is by the way you communicate to others.
Yes.
And getting it completely off base.
Yes. So what a tangled web we weave.
Yes. Huh? Just get every potential partner to take the quiz.
That's right. That's right. And a whole bunch of other psychological assessments, and things will go so much better. Yeah. So let's go over the 5, and I'll go into a little detail about them. On the surface, they all sound very easy, but each one, he took a whole chapter to describe. So there certainly is more to kind of the nuance of each of these. Now, something I encourage people to do maybe while I'm going over these is to think about each one of these and how it sits with you, and see if you can even just guess what you think your primary love language is. And then maybe, is that how you show love? And kind of just think of it as you're listening. So the first of the 5 is words of affirmation. So people whose primary love language is words of affirmation, they need to hear you say positive things about them. Now, there's some obvious things. If someone tells you you're attractive, you're beautiful, I love you, you're so sweet, you're so smart, all of these things. So those are the really obvious words of affirmation. But really, the category of words of affirmation goes a lot broader than that, in that it might be something like, if you said to me, Terri, I'm thinking about writing a book, but I don't know. I just don't know if I can do it. If I said, Daisy, I know from what I've read of yours that you're a strong writer and you've got a really strong message. I think you should really keep considering that.
Yeah, I see.
That's words of affirmation. I'm giving you that vote of confidence. I'm pointing out positive things about you. So it's not just compliments.
Yeah.
It's, again, words of affirmation. It's words that kind of wrap you up and hold you up, boost you up a little bit. As I said, he went into a lot of detail. There are different dialects. He uses this. If this is the language, these are the various dialects. But I think most of us can do pretty well just to know this is words of affirmation, positive things that you say about the person.
There must be quite a big cultural influence as well, presumably. With just you're affected by society's way of giving, even with that example of how you reassure people, how you boost people's confidence, how you affirm different things, has a cultural twist to it.
I'm sure there are cultures where that is not a very popular love language. It's not very common because it's not culturally something that people do, and other cultures where it's very normal to do that. The next love language is quality time. And it's not just hanging out with someone, but the thing that differentiates quality time is it is really kind of undivided time. So some people might say, well, I don't know why my wife is complaining. I mean, I sat by her on the couch while I was watching the football game the other night.
Yeah, I get it.
But that doesn't mean you were actually paying any attention. You weren't looking in her eyes. You weren't having meaningful conversations. And again, going into the dialects of quality time, people who value quality time as their primary love language, one of the dialects, I don't remember the word he used, but it's also kind of in-depth conversation. Not small talk, but let's dig in. Let's really do intimate kind of conversation and things. So quality time is the second one. The next one is receiving gifts. Probably pretty obvious. It's someone gives you something, buys you a present, brings you something, share some kind of a memento of something. For people whose primary love language is receiving gifts, it does not have to be an expensive gift unless there are reasons why. But, it could be, their child brought home a dead dandelion. And they're like, oh my gosh, that just, I know how much that kid loves me. That was so sweet.
Yeah.
So it's giving and receiving gifts, that your partner or your significant other brings you gifts, gives you things.
And presumably, well, I say presumably, I guess it's a question. Is it a bit like the one before where it was quality time? It's not just time spent. It's the quality of that time. And actually, it might be quite a short amount of time, but if that short amount of time is real quality time, it's going to mean more than somebody who sits with you for 3 hours but is constantly scrolling on their phone and not listening to you while you're telling them about their day or whatever. It'd be better to have a 10-minute in-depth conversation than 3 hours of nothing, really, of sort of sitting there feeling, you're together, but you're feeling lonely. Is it the same with gifts? In that gift has to have some thought behind it? Or is that just a sort of a subset of this love language? Somebody just giving you any old gift. I mean, as we're talking about Valentine's, and as we're this is the area that you spoke about a lot in the fasting method podcast episode. We were moving away from giving the typical Valentine's gifts of chocolates, say. But would it be that you needed someone to have really thought about a gift that was appropriate for you, a gift that would show, that they knew you, that they cared about you, rather than picking up a bunch of flowers from the petrol station on the way home, kind of thing?
I think actually both, but it is a good distinction to make. Because let's say, for example, someone comes home and brings me a gift. It's something I don't know anything about. I might still feel very loved because I might think, wow, they thought of me, decided this would be something that I might like. They wanted me to feel joy. I might feel loved. Now, I may also, let's say that person brings me football tickets. I'm going to keep using the football reference here. They bring me football tickets and they're like, babe, I'm so excited. We're going to this football game. If I really don't like football, that doesn't feel like a gift. That to me might feel like, oh, you wanted to go to the football game, so you're going to include me. That doesn't help me feel loved necessarily.
Yeah.
So different people with each of these might require it to come in a certain package or look a certain way or sound a certain way to really be what it is that they need specifically in that overall language. Again, In his book, he talks a little bit more about there are dialects within each language. The next one is acts of service. So doing something for someone, demonstrating that you love them. If I come to your house and mow your lawn and you think, wow, she really loves me. I don't even know much more to say about this one because it seems so obvious. It's doing things for people. I know, for example, my dad's love language was acts of service. If you'd go visit for the day, he would go change your oil. I didn't care about my oil, but for my dad, that meant more than him sitting down to say, hey, how's life? And I really love you. I changed your oil. I did this amazing thing for you. This was a great example of if I don't receive acts of service as my primary love language, I might think, why did he do that? Big deal.
Yeah, it's a great example that you mentioned the mowing the lawn thing. I can remember, it's so funny when you mentioned that because straight away it brought to my mind an example of that mismatch. Now, this wasn't an example of a romantic love language, but it was a, thoughtful doing for a friend thing where I trimmed their garden and they came back and they were, bearing in mind this is grass. One, it was grass. Two, I was a very good and tidy trimmer that made it pretty well look like it had been mown. You can already see I'm getting het up. They were really annoyed that I'd done it because I hadn't done it the way they like to do it with the mower and such and such. So, I mean, you know me. You can imagine how hurt I felt by that. I'd gone to the time and the effort of doing something that I thought would really appreciate because I knew they were going to be coming back from holiday and they had, it was for a gîte, so they had guests coming. I knew they'd be busy. I thought, well, this is great. This is taking something that takes a couple of hours to do. It's going to be something ticked off their list that they won't have to think about. But now I've got a slap in the face. So, yes, I can see clear how a mismatch like that.
Again, you just really highlighted, I might feel like I'm doing such a loving, giving thing, and it may fall very flat because it's not in the language. I'm giving it in Spanish, and the receiver only perceives it in French. And so it's missed.
Yeah.
So acts of service, one of the things he talked about, and in each chapter, he does talk about some examples of things that you could do if this is your partner's love language. One of the things he talked about in this chapter that I thought was helpful is you could ask, or you could think, what are some requests that my partner has had of me in the past couple of weeks? They wanted me to cook dinner. They wanted me to do the dishes. They wanted me to take the kids somewhere, whatever. Okay, I'm going to do one of those and watch their response. Do it unasked.
Yes, because that's often the thing, isn't it? I remember very clearly my mother getting very annoyed with me when I was a teenager for not doing different things around the house. And I didn't know what needed doing and would just ask, well, why can't you just leave me a list? Leave me a list and I'll do it. But you should know what needs doing without me having to ask. So again, it's this mismatch. Yes, like you say, if you're looking out for these things, if you're aware of it, you can start figuring it out.
That's right. But you just highlighted another really big example that becomes a problem in marriages or relationships, obviously, and other relationships. But we expect the other person to be a mind reader. You know what the important things are, Daisy. No, I don't, because they're important to you. They're not important to me. I lived with someone in the past who I had a lot of Tupperware and Rubbermaid. They would take it out of the dishwasher and leave it on the countertop because would not go near that cupboard. Didn't bother me that it was sitting on the countertop for weeks. Drove them crazy. Like, why won't you just put it away? I'm like, oh, I didn't notice. So what's important to one person doesn't mean it made it to the list of what's important to the other person. So if you know that your partner's love language is acts of service, you might want to think about what things have they been asking me to do?
Yeah.
How can I do that?
Yeah. What things can I see stresses them out and they have to do. Or maybe they, if they're like my mother, sigh often when they're doing it. Or there's lots of tutting and huffing and puffing. And
yeah.
Be aware.
Or what do they feel best when they take off their to-do list?
Yeah.
Could I take that off their list? And he did talk about, let's say, for example, you don't have the time to do the act of service, but you can afford to pay someone to do it. That counts.
Yeah.
I could pay someone to come and clean the house rather than me taking all day and cleaning the house. But giving that person that message of, I love you, I see what's important to you, and I do this. So acts of service. And then are we already to the last one? The last one is physical touch. And for many people, this one gets kind of convoluted in that they think it's only sexual touch. And of course, that is part of this.
No, hugs,
but many people,
all sorts.
Yeah. And, there's research about infants that are brought up without touch, without skin contact and things, that it affects how we develop. So touch, sitting up against each other, holding hands, putting your hand on someone while you're talking to them. Yeah. I am not a big touch person. And one of my friends, whenever she would talk to you, she would always just want to put her hand on your shoulder. I'm like, wow, that is so weird. But for her, that was connecting. That was just natural. So touch is a really big one. And often a difference in male-female relationships. One may have a higher need for touch being really important. And again, not just sexual touch. And so it gets misunderstood or misinterpreted in the relationship. So those are the 5. So again, words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service, receiving gifts, and touch. Okay. So I'm curious, Daisy, as you've been listening, do you have a sense of what yours is?
Well, it's funny because I pretty well knew you were going to ask me that. And I did make a note as we were going, especially with the first one, but I think probably with quite a lot of them, when I mentioned that there might be that cultural influence. I would imagine, I'm sure it's a sweeping statement, but there's quite a lot of difference between the sexes. I mean, you just mentioned that there, quite a male-female thing. But I can remember thinking that, particularly when you were talking about the first one, the words of affirmation, that it's quite often a common complaint in straight relationships anyway, that you quite often hear from the female side. But honestly, I'm struggling to think which one I would come out top. I mean, you mentioned Gretchen Rubin's 4 tendencies, and I feel very split between 2. But even 2, I'm struggling. I would say that my lowest on the list would be the receiving gifts and maybe acts of service. I would say the words of affirmation would be very important to me. The physical touch, if we're talking about, especially if we were talking about a romantic relationship, physical touch would be important to me. Hugging, holding hands. I can remember, I mean, I haven't been in a relationship for donkey's years, but I can remember back when. And, I would want to be holding hands with somebody. I would want to walk down the road holding their hands, and I would probably feel quite hurt and rejected if they didn't want to hold my hand. So that's clearly something that's quite important to me. The words of affirmation, definitely across the board in all relationships. So I guess maybe that would be my dominant one. The quality time thing is definitely something I struggle with if I feel like I don't expect somebody to be paying attention to me all the time, but if we're having a conversation and they're, scrolling along on their phone or something, I would feel pretty hurt by that. So, going back to that, what did we call it? Asking the thoughtful, authentic questions. So showing somebody that you're thinking about them, showing somebody that you're interested in them. And if you're focus is elsewhere, then I don't really feel like you're doing that. But so I'm sort of talking through them all. I suppose if I had to pick one, it would probably be the words of affirmation would probably come out highest. I would be very interested to do the quiz and see which one, but I would guess that one would just edge it, but I'm sure there would be a close second, depending a bit, I guess, whether it's a romantic relationship or not. The physical touch one would be very important to me in a romantic relationship, but not so important with, like to hug friends and things, but I wouldn't take it as much of a slight as I would in a romantic relationship. So it would depend a little bit, I think, which relationship. But if you're sort of talking about a general across all kinds of relationships, yes, I think it would probably have to be the words of affirmation.
And how do you think you most communicate love?
I would say, I don't know. Because, of course, I suppose there are things the way you'd like to think you are with maybe the way that you come across. There could be a mismatch there.
Or maybe it's hard to know because maybe, Daisy, you are so good at intuiting other people's love languages that you do them all.
I don't know about that. I certainly try, I would say, again, it would probably lean towards words of affirmation. I think I certainly try to, but certainly when I'm communicating with some people is to really focus on them. And I guess the acts of service I've got a little bit into the habit of over the years because finances have been an issue. So for me, it's been a good creative way to get around not having the money to go down the gift giving route. I can give gifts by giving of my time, performing an act of service like trimming someone's lawn without getting paid. Things like that. So something that costs me some of my time, costs me some thought, but is not going to cost me money that I don't have. So I suppose that's another thing, the way circumstances in your life might lead you down certain paths as well.
You just highlighted another important, there's a chapter in there, some kind of questions that come in a lot. And people say, does this change over time? Kind of like personality change, my one way through my early years and then a different way later. And his belief really is that our primary love language doesn't change, but it may not appear quite as important at certain times. And he used an example with a couple with young kids. Let's say in this example, he used a husband and wife. So let's say the husband learned that his wife really needs words of affirmation. And he's giving her all these positive things. And she might say, look, I don't care if you think I'm attractive right now. And I don't care how smart you think I am. I just need you to go change the baby's diapers and do some laundry. That what she really needs at that time may not be her primary love language, but it may be more just based on life situation.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
And then another question came in about, kind of navigating this with your kids. And that same kind of topic came up about, let's say, for example, your young child you find their love language is touch. They always want to be sitting on your lap, have your arm around them. They like to cuddle, hold your hand when they walk places. Well, when they turn 17, they're not going to want to do any of that. No. And they're actually going to think it's really weird and inappropriate. That doesn't mean that their need for touch went away, but you're going to have to do it differently. You might need to, kind of do that side punch into the shoulder when he walks into the room. Because if his love language is touch, that didn't stop. He just doesn't want to cuddle on the couch with you anymore. And so just recognizing that it is a primary need that kind of transcends time, but it may look different over time.
And of course, you can always satisfy that by having dogs.
Right?
And you see, I've always forced that need for physical touch on them. They always say, especially when, you're adopting dogs, that you shouldn't shower them with kisses and get them to cuddle you and stuff. I've always just ignored that, and they've ended up coming round. So
Like, this is about my needs, darn it.
yes, you will come round, and they always do. But what about you, Terri? What's your primary love language?
I believe through experience and the quizzes that my primary love language is quality time. And that's how I most feel loved.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't always think it's my way of expressing it. I think it is high on my list for that. But I think acts of service are actually my primary way of showing love.
Right.
I like doing things for people. I like doing things they don't even anticipate. I like figuring out what they need and taking care of it. But I don't necessarily feel that as much as I believe someone else will feel it if that's what I do for them. So again, an example where I think my two highest on the list are a little different for how I most feel loved versus how I most often express love.
It's very interesting. And how would you suggest that we would go about trying to find out, assuming that we figure out what our own love language is just by thinking things through like we've been chatting today, or doing the quiz, or both, or thinking about, I suppose you could think about examples with a partner or some, a loved one, a friend, or whoever it is, sort of go through the different love languages and think of examples and sort of sit and think about how you feel about all those different ones. It's probably fairly easy to figure out, at least reasonably, what your top one or two is. But how do you go about figuring out other people's? Because it's not always obvious, is it? Especially when you're tainted, you're looking through those rose-tinted glasses of whatever your love language is. How do you figure out somebody else's without necessarily asking them?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's a great conversation to have with people.
Yeah, why not?
How could I show you that I love you right now? How would you feel loved? What would help right now? Those kinds of questions I think are good. Many people, if you start talking about this, they can identify what's most important to them. But the other thing that he said, and I know this, I almost cringe a little bit when I think of it, but I think it is a really good way to assess what are the most complaints about? What are your, significant other, best friend, or if they complain, what does your partner tell you they're not getting from you? Because usually the things that they complain about the most really reveal where their biggest need is. So if someone says, you just never touch me. You always sit over there.
Yeah.
Just feel like you're never close to me. Ding, 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 ding. Or if someone says, you do so many nice things for me and stuff, but I don't even know if you like me. Like, I don't know if you just never tell me how you feel. Maybe words of affirmation are more important than I thought. And so paying attention
you've got to listen, observe. And that in itself is a love language, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And to not be defensive. If someone tells me, so for example, in my relationships, I often hear, you don't touch enough, you sit too far away. And I have to remember, because that's not my love language, I forget that it's important. So I have to make conscious effort. And it's not painful. I don't mean that this is like torture for me, but I have to remember holding hands, sliding over, putting my arm around her. That makes a difference because that's their love language. So learning not to be defensive of what feedback am I getting. Even let's use an example of, you leave dirty socks all over the place. I'm so tired of that. Usually there's something more beyond that. What does it mean to that person? That you're not thinking about them, that you don't care, that their need for everything to be perfectly put away is really important. Okay, I want to start communicating that to them, that it does matter to me. I would leave my socks laying all over, but I know this is really important to you, so I've been picking them up.
Now, what happens if you have figured out your love language both ways, and you figured out your partner's love language, and there is a disconnect, and it's a disconnect. I mean, we'll use the example of touch because that's quite an easy one to imagine. But what happens if that's your most important love language from a receiving point of view, but your partner really doesn't like? I mean, I know there are conditions and things where it's just not their love language, it's not really on their radar, but they really don't like being touched, and they really don't like touching. What do you do to get over that? Do you have to just find a way to work around and find a middle ground using the other love languages? Or do you at some point have to decide, well, this is so important to me, if you can't meet that need, this isn't going to work?
Yep. And when I hear you ask that question, I look at it even beyond the love language. It's like, this is a need. So let's say, for example, nowhere in here did we talk about honesty, but let's say my primary need in a relationship is honesty. And the person I'm with, every couple of months, there's a big lie that comes out. I'm going to have to decide, is that okay? Is that, can I tolerate that? Is that something doable in my system? Or is that too much for my system? Is it too intolerable and I need to not be in this relationship? So using touch as an example, I think is a great one, or any of these really. But the idea, what if, like you said, your love language is almost impossible for that other person for whatever reasons? But most of us, we don't only have one. We have a primary, but so what if touch is my primary and I'm with someone who, for their own physical reasons, can't do touch safely or comfortably? One, I'm going to try and really highlight when I do get touch, because I know that's really significant coming from them. And then two, I might look at, can they work with me on my other ones that are kind of high on the list? But let's say, for example, that person is great at words of affirmation, but words of affirmation is my least prominent one. I'm going to have to work with them and say, thank you for saying that. That's nice. That doesn't do it for me. I'm going to need quality time, or I'm going to need you to work on this. Kind of acknowledging, I get it. You can't work much more on the touch one, but I'm going to need you to address these others then. And as you said then, Daisy, I think we all then have to make that decision. Is this enough? Do I feel fulfilled? And it's not, I don't think it's as petty as, well, that person does not do enough acts of service, they're gone.
Yeah.
But it's really saying, I don't feel loved enough. I don't. And then the other side that I was going to say about this, kind of going back to the example I used of my dad, but in various relationships, people have lots of examples of this. I may have to sometimes look at affirmations might be the way they most communicate it, even though that's not the way I receive it. And that person's giving me a lot of affirmation. They are busting their butt to show me they love me. Unfortunately, they're speaking in Spanish and I only know French. But sometimes that helps. And it helped me to say, gosh, why is he always talking about this damn oil change and stuff? I don't care about that. That was his way of saying, I love you. I'm checking on you. Are you okay? I'm taking care of this.
Yeah, and learning to appreciate that, and learning, like you say, that's their way of showing you they love you. And even if it doesn't meet all your needs, you can make it get part way there just by really appreciating and realizing that they are showing you they love you. They're just speaking in a different language, but they are fundamentally showing you they love you.
That's right.
And that's important.
That's right.
Because of course the other thing you get into, hear that age old, or I got together with him and then I set about changing him. And you have to just be with the person you are. You can't expect to change them. You can't expect to change them once you married them. They're not suddenly going to become a different person. So you get into that, all that kind of thing. You don't, ultimately, you talk about that, what did you call it? The love obsession to start with, where you've sort of got the blinkers on probably to some of the things that irritate you, and then they become a bit more to the fore, and once all these things settle down. But ultimately, you fell in love with someone as they were, and okay, there was this cloud of love obsession going on, but you can't then expect someone to completely change to suit you, but neither should you completely change to suit them. So I guess it really comes down to some kind of bit of change coming from both directions and meeting somewhere in the middle, if you want it to work, of course.
And in my own experience, and sometimes in working with couples or part of a couple, I would really explore that. Do you have a sense that the person is honoring and working on being more communicative in your love language? Or are they refusing? If they're refusing and saying, look, this is what I can do, and if you don't like it, goodbye. Okay. But if you can see that they are willing to work with you, they're willing to hit the middle ground at least, that makes a big difference.
Well, I do think the mind reader element is important as well. Mm-hmm. You can't always expect people to realize, talking about the physical aspect, way back in the day, and you just expect somebody to know, when you're talking about physical romantic touch, you expect somebody to know what you like. You expect them to be able to work off your reactions or whatever it is. But, as you get a bit older, you realize that sometimes, you have to talk about it. You have to ask for what
Absolutely.
you want. You can't just expect someone to know everything. And it's, it's the same for all sorts of things. So there is some, you do have to communicate as well. You can't just expect somebody to figure it out, even though you should expect them to do a bit of figuring out because you do.
And you have to advocate for your needs.
Yeah.
So again, mine being quality time. If someone is sitting there on their phone and I'm engaging in a conversation with them, I might say, I'm going to wait until you're done. I'm like, no, I'm listening. No, I'm going to wait until you're done, because for me, this conversation doesn't feel good until I know this is the only thing you're doing.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be. It's not, no, I'm not expecting, I know you're in the middle of doing something that's taking your attention, and that's fine. Just, I need more of your attention. So, but I'm happy, I'll go and do something else, or I'll read my book or whatever, and until you can give me your attention, that's fine.
That's right.
But yes, you have to speak up, don't you?
That's right. And interestingly, I've learned this about myself more recently. My need for quality time doesn't mean I need a ton of time.
No.
Kind of what you touched on earlier. I just need that when there is time, it matters. Then I feel very loved, but I don't have to have someone in my back pocket to feel loved.
Yeah, because who is it who talks about it? I think, in fact, I'm sure Rangan Chatterjee has talked about it, and he learnt about it from someone else. So it's not coming from him as an original idea, but he talked about, and I'm not sure if he called it the tea ceremony, but it was sitting down with a cup of tea with his wife. And, so it could be 5 minutes. You both had busy lives and had their kids and all the rest of it, but they would share a cup of tea and they would share a quality conversation every day. They would sit down and they would have their cup of tea and they would have that full on, not distracted by anything else conversation. And that might just be your special little 5 minutes carved out of every single day. That's not much time, is it? But that could mean the world.
Mm-hmm. I don't need 18 hours.
No.
That 5 minutes could satisfy the need. All right, Daisy, we did not do what we said.
No, we didn't.
It's probably the longest episode now.
Yes, I've been complaining at Terri for her episodes being very long, which takes me a long time to edit. But I think everyone at home will agree that this was really, really interesting. See, I knew it would be. I knew there would be so much more to dig into from the tantalizing amounts that I got on the Fasting Method podcast the other day. So thank you very much for that. I very enjoyed hearing about all the different love languages. It's given me lots to think about.
Very good. And thanks for choosing something that I felt comfortable to share, having talked about it for years. So that's always fun for me.
I hope everyone at home can put some of these things into practice for Valentine's Day, but of course for every day.
And you can take a quiz.
And you can, and everybody loves a quiz, which I shall be doing as soon as we finish.
Take good care, everybody.
Have a wonderful week.